The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Mitchell's well-maintained front yard as he slowly made his way down his porch steps. At 93 years old, every movement was deliberate, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he adjusted his favorite navy blue veteran cap, the one that proudly displayed his World War II service years. Harold had lived in the same modest white house on Maple Street for over 5 decades. The neighborhood had changed around him, but his property remained a testament to his dedication. His garden, though small, burst with colorful marigolds and perfectly trimmed rose bushes, a hobby that kept his hands busy and his mind active since his wife Martha's passing 8 years ago. Every morning, without fail, Harold followed the same routine. He would wake up at 6:30 a.m., put on his pressed khaki pants and a clean button-down shirt, and prepare for his daily walk to Betty's diner. The walk was only 4 blocks, but with his aluminum walker, it took him exactly 23 minutes. He didn't mind. Harold believed that keeping a schedule was what kept him going at his age. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," called Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street as she collected her morning newspaper. She had moved in 5 years ago and always made sure to check on him. "Morning, Gloria," Harold called back, lifting one hand from his walker to wave. He noticed she had planted new flowers in her front yard. Those purple ones looked mighty fine. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood accompanied his slow but steady journey: birds chirping, children waiting for school buses, and the distant hum of morning traffic. Harold knew every crack in the sidewalk, every loose pebble that might catch his walker. Years of military training had taught him to be observant, and age had only made him more careful. Betty's diner sat on the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, its red and chrome exterior gleaming in the morning light. The small restaurant had been there even longer than Harold had lived in the neighborhood. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open, announcing his arrival to the familiar faces inside. "Well, if it isn't our favorite veteran," Betty herself called from behind the counter. At 68, she was the daughter of the original Betty and had known Harold since she was a teenager. "Your usual booth is waiting, Harold." The booth in question was the third one from the door, positioned perfectly to see both the street outside and the entire diner inside. Old habits from his military days made him prefer seats with good visibility. The vinyl seats were worn smooth from years of use, and Harold knew every scratch on the Formica tabletop. "Morning, Betty," Harold replied, carefully maneuvering himself into the booth. His walker found its usual spot against the wall. "Coffee first, please." The diner hummed with morning activity. The regulars, mostly retirees and early shift workers, nodded in Harold's direction. Many had heard his stories over the years, tales of his time serving in the Pacific, his 30-year career at the local post office after the war, and the wonderful life he built with Martha. As Betty brought his coffee, black, with 2 sugars, Harold pulled out his worn leather wallet. Inside, behind his driver's license, renewed just last month, "Thank you very much," he kept a small photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself in his military uniform, standing proud and tall. Sometimes he could hardly believe that young soldier and he were the same person. "French toast coming right up," Betty said, without needing to take his order. "Extra crispy on the edges, just how you like it." Harold smiled, carefully adding his sugar to his coffee. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, creating patterns on the worn tabletop. From his seat, he could see the parking lot, usually empty except for a few regular customers' cars. It was peaceful, predictable, and exactly how he liked to start his day. Little did Harold know that this familiar routine, one he had followed for over 3 decades, was about to face an unexpected disruption. But for now, in this quiet moment with his coffee warming his hands and the comfortable sounds of the diner surrounding him, everything was just as it should be. Harold Mitchell was content, surrounded by the simple pleasures that made his life worth living, even at 93 years old. The peaceful atmosphere of Betty's diner changed dramatically one Tuesday morning in early October. Harold was halfway through his French toast when the first rumble of motorcycle engines shook the diner's windows. At first, it was just a distant sound, but it grew louder until the noise became impossible to ignore. 6 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The riders were dressed in black leather jackets with some kind of logo on the back that Harold couldn't quite make out from his booth. They parked their bikes in a row, taking up several spaces near the diner's entrance. "Well, that's new," Betty said, refilling Harold's coffee cup. Her forehead wrinkled with concern as she watched the bikers dismount their motorcycles. "Never seen them around here before." The bell above the door chimed aggressively as the group entered. They were younger men, mostly in their 30s, with tattoos covering their arms and heavy boots that thudded against the linoleum floor. The peaceful morning chatter in the diner died down to uncomfortable silence. The bikers claimed the largest booth in the corner, their loud voices and rough laughter filling the previously quiet space. A few of the regular customers exchanged worried glances. Mrs. Peterson, who always sat by the window with her crossword puzzle, gathered her belongings and hurried out, leaving her half-finished tea behind. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" Betty asked, approaching their table with forced cheerfulness. Her hand trembled slightly as she held her notepad. "Coffee, black, and make it quick," one of them barked. He appeared to be their leader, with a thick beard and a snake tattoo crawling up his neck. "And none of that weak stuff you served to the old-timers." Harold watched the scene unfold from his usual booth, his appetite diminishing. The comment about old-timers was clearly directed at the diner's regular customers, most of whom were retirees like himself. He noticed how Betty's shoulders tensed as she hurried to fulfill their orders. Over the next hour, the bikers' presence dominated the diner. They complained about the food being too slow, played loud music from a portable speaker, and made crude jokes that made the other customers uncomfortable. Two elderly couples who usually came in around 8 o'clock took one look through the window and decided to walk past. "Remember when this place had some class?" one of the bikers said loudly, deliberately making eye contact with Harold. "Now it's just a hangout for fossils." Harold kept his eyes on his coffee cup, but his hand tightened around the handle. He thought about the photograph in his wallet, of the young soldier who had faced much worse than a group of loud motorcyclists. Still, this was different. This was his sanctuary, his morning routine, his piece of normal life. The next day, they were back, and the day after that. Each morning, they arrived just as the regular breakfast crowd was settling in, disrupting the peaceful atmosphere with their loud bikes and even louder voices. They began to park their motorcycles closer to the diner's windows, the vibrations from their engines rattling the glass and disturbing conversations inside. Betty tried her best to maintain order, but Harold could see the worry lines deepening on her face. The diner's regular customers started arriving later or earlier to avoid the bikers, but Harold refused to change his schedule. He had faced artillery fire in the Pacific. He wasn't about to let a group of troublemakers alter his routine. One morning, as Harold made his way to his usual booth, he overheard snippets of the bikers' conversation. They were planning to make this their regular meeting spot, talking about bringing more of their group members. The leader mentioned something about claiming their territory. The final straw came when Betty approached Harold's table with tears in her eyes. "They're driving away my customers," she whispered, glancing nervously at the bikers' table. "My morning business is down by half. I don't know what to do, Harold." Looking around the once bustling diner, Harold saw empty booths where friends used to sit. The cheerful morning conversations had been replaced by the harsh sound of motorcycle engines and crude laughter. The place that had been his second home for 30 years was changing, and not for the better. As Harold gripped his walker and prepared to leave that morning, he felt something stirring inside him, a familiar feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. It was the same determination that had carried him through the war, through losing Martha, through all of life's challenges. The bikers might have disrupted his peaceful routine, but Harold Mitchell wasn't done fighting yet. The situation at Betty's diner grew worse over the next 2 weeks. Harold maintained his routine, but each morning brought new challenges. The bikers, who now called themselves the Road Demons, had noticed how the elderly veteran never changed his schedule despite their presence, and this seemed to irritate them. One particularly chilly morning, as Harold made his careful way across the parking lot with his walker, the group's leader, who everyone called Snake, deliberately revved his motorcycle engine. The sudden noise startled Harold, causing him to grip his walker tighter. The other bikers laughed, and Snake grinned with satisfaction. "Look alive, Grandpa," Snake called out, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Wouldn't want you to have a heart attack out here." More laughter followed from his companions. Harold kept his eyes forward and continued his steady pace toward the diner's entrance. His military training had taught him that responding to provocations often made situations worse. but his silence only seemed to encourage them further. "Hey, what's with the hat, old-timer?" one of the younger bikers called out, pointing to Harold's World War II veteran cap. "You play soldier back in the Stone Age." The others snickered at this comment. Inside the diner, things weren't much better. The bikers had claimed the tables near Harold's usual booth, surrounding him with their hostile presence. They would talk loudly about how the dinosaurs needed to clear out and make way for the new generation. Betty tried to create a buffer by seating other customers away from them, but the diner wasn't big enough to provide much separation. Harold noticed how they had begun to intimidate other customers too. They would make crude remarks about Mrs. Wilson's hearing aid or Mr. Thompson's cane. Several longtime customers stopped coming altogether. The morning crowd had dwindled to just a handful of regulars who, like Harold, refused to be driven away. One morning, as Harold stirred his coffee, he overheard Snake talking on his phone. "Yeah, we've almost got this place cleared out," he was saying. "Few more weeks, and all the old folks will be gone. Perfect spot for our operations." The word operations caught Harold's attention. His years in military intelligence had taught him to pick up on such details. He began to notice other suspicious behaviors. The frequent trips to the bathroom by different group members, the suspicious packages they sometimes exchanged in the parking lot, the coded language they used in their conversations. The situation reached a new level when they began to physically intimidate him. They would park their bikes so close to the entrance that Harold barely had room to maneuver his walker. They would blow cigarette smoke in his direction, knowing it made him cough. Once, one of them deliberately bumped his table, causing his coffee to spill. Betty tried to intervene one morning when they were being particularly loud. "Gentlemen, please keep it down. You're disturbing the other customers." Snake stood up, towering over her. "Other customers? You mean these fossils?" He gestured around the diner. "Face it, lady. This place needs new blood. The dinosaur age is over." Harold watched as Betty retreated behind her counter, her hands shaking as she poured coffee. He thought about all the years she had served him breakfast, how she had helped him through his first difficult months after Martha's passing, always making sure he ate properly. The final straw came on a rainy Thursday morning. Harold was making his way through the parking lot, moving carefully on the wet pavement, when three of the bikers surrounded him. Snake stepped in front of his walker, blocking his path. "You know, old-timer," Snake said, leaning down to get in Harold's face. "Most people would have taken the hint by now. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else for your morning coffee." Harold looked up slowly, meeting Snake's eyes. For the first time, he spoke directly to his tormentors. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of his years of military service. "Son," he said, "I've faced worse than you on better days." The bikers laughed, but Harold noticed Snake's smile falter slightly at the steadiness in his voice. They moved aside, letting him pass, but Harold knew this was just the beginning. As he settled into his booth, his hand steady as he unfolded his napkin, his mind was already working. These boys thought they were dealing with a frail old man, someone they could easily intimidate and push around. But they had made a serious mistake. They had underestimated Harold Mitchell, and more importantly, they had threatened his community. It was time to show them that some old soldiers never lost their fighting spirit. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Harold woke up at his usual time, put on his pressed khaki pants, a clean blue button-down shirt, and his cherished veteran cap. The weather forecast predicted rain, so he checked that his walker's rubber tips were secure. At 93, he couldn't risk any slips or falls. What he didn't expect was to find the entire Road Demons gang waiting in Betty's parking lot. There were more of them than usual, at least 15 motorcycles lined up in a semicircle near the entrance. Harold could see Betty watching nervously through the diner's window as he approached. Snake stepped forward as Harold neared the door, deliberately positioning himself in the way. "Well, look who's still not getting the message," he sneered, crossing his tattooed arms. The other bikers formed a loose circle around Harold. "Excuse me," Harold said calmly, though his heart was beating faster. "I'd like to get my breakfast." "You know what I think?" Snake said, looking around at his gang members. "I think our friend here needs a clearer message. Maybe a demonstration of why this isn't a safe place for him anymore." Before Harold could react, one of the younger bikers kicked his walker hard. The aluminum frame skittered across the wet pavement, leaving Harold unsteady on his feet. He reached out instinctively, trying to grab something to keep his balance, but there was nothing to hold on to. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. Harold could feel himself starting to fall. He thought about Martha, about the promises he'd made to her about taking care of himself. He thought about his unit in the Pacific, about never showing weakness in the face of adversity. But then something remarkable happened. Instead of falling, Harold straightened his spine. Decades of military bearing took over. His feet found their position naturally, shoulder width apart, balanced, steady. He stood tall, all 6 feet of him, looking Snake directly in the eyes. The parking lot fell silent. Even the bikers seemed surprised. They had expected him to fall, to show fear, to finally break. Instead, they found themselves facing a veteran who suddenly didn't look old or frail at all. "Son," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of his military years, "in 1944, I faced down enemy fire on beaches you've only seen in movies. I've watched good men die defending the very freedoms that allow you to stand here and act like thugs. I've lived through things that would turn your hair white." He took a step forward, and surprisingly, Snake took a small step back. "I didn't survive a world war to be intimidated by a bunch of playground bullies in leather jackets. You want to push around an old man? Go ahead. But understand this, I faced real demons in my life, and you boys are playing dress-up." The silence in the parking lot was deafening. Even the morning traffic seemed to have gone quiet. Through the diner's window, Harold could see Betty with her phone in her hand, ready to call for help if needed. Snake's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. "You got a big mouth for an old-timer," he growled, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Harold bent down slowly, deliberately, and picked up his walker. His joints protested, but he ignored the pain. As he straightened up, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: uncertainty in the biker's eyes. They had expected their victim to beg, to cower, to run away. They didn't know how to handle someone who stood his ground. "Now," Harold said, adjusting his veteran cap, "I'm going inside to have my breakfast. Anyone who wants to stop me should remember, I didn't earn this cap at a souvenir shop." He moved forward, and to everyone's surprise, the circle of bikers parted. Even Snake stepped aside, though he tried to cover it by pretending to check his phone. As Harold reached the diner's door, he heard murmuring behind him. The bikers were conferring among themselves, clearly unsure about what to do next. Their carefully constructed intimidation had just crumbled in the face of real courage. Inside the diner, Betty rushed to help him to his usual booth. "Harold, are you okay? Should I call the police?" Harold sat down carefully, his heart still racing but his voice steady. "No, Betty, but I would like my coffee. And then, if you don't mind, I need to make a few phone calls. It's time we did something about our unwelcome guests." As Betty hurried to get his coffee, Harold reached for his wallet. Behind his ID, next to the photo of his younger self in uniform, was a small card he hadn't needed to use in years. It was time to call in some old favors. After finishing his breakfast that morning, Harold didn't go straight home as usual. Instead, he made his way slowly to the public library, which opened at 9 a.m. Miss Jenkins, the head librarian who had known Harold for 20 years, looked surprised to see him at a different time than his usual Saturday visits. "Harold, is everything all right?" she asked, noticing his determined expression. "Just fine, Sarah," he replied with a gentle smile. "I need to use one of those computer stations, if you don't mind, and maybe a little help getting started." Miss Jenkins helped Harold settle at a computer in the corner where he could see the entire room, another old habit from his military days. His fingers moved slowly but surely over the keyboard as he began his research. First, he looked up the Road Demons Motorcycle Club. What he found was interesting. They weren't registered with any official motorcycle association. Careful and thorough, Harold muttered to himself, remembering his old intelligence training. That's how you win battles. He spent the next 3 hours meticulously gathering information. The local news website showed several complaints about motorcycle gangs in neighboring towns. The city's zoning website revealed that the diner's parking lot wasn't zoned for regular large group gatherings. Most importantly, he found several noise ordinance violations that could be documented. During his research, Harold pulled out his old address book, its leather cover worn from years of use. He began making calls from the library's phone room. The first was to Jim Martinez, who had served with him in the Pacific and now worked at City Hall. Jim, Harold Mitchell here. Remember that favor you owe me from 46? I think it's time to collect. Next, he called Robert Chen, whose father Harold had helped get citizenship papers after the war. Robert was now a respected lawyer in town. Robert, this is Harold Mitchell, your father's old friend. I need some legal advice about public nuisance laws. Between calls, Harold documented everything. He took notes in his precise military handwriting, creating files with dates, times, and specific incidents. He remembered his commanding officer's words from basic training. Good intelligence wins wars before they start. By early afternoon, Harold had filled 5 pages with notes and made 12 phone calls. The picture was becoming clearer. The road demons weren't just random troublemakers. They were trying to establish territory for less than legal activities. Their pattern matched similar situations in other towns where they had driven out legitimate businesses. Harold's last call was to Captain Thomas at the local police station. They had known each other for years through the Veterans Association. Mike, Harold Mitchell here. Remember when you said the police needed more community cooperation to handle troublemakers? Well, I've got something for you. Using his walker, Harold made his way to the library's printer and collected his research. Miss Jenkins helped him organize everything into a folder, watching with curiosity as he carefully arranged the papers. Harold, she said, looking at his meticulous notes, you haven't lost your touch from your intelligence days, have you? He smiled, patting the folder. Some skills you never forget, Sarah, like riding a bicycle, though I don't do much of that these days. Before leaving the library, Harold made one final call to his old friend George Washington Ayo, who ran the largest legitimate motorcycle club in the state, the Veterans Riders Association. George had served in Vietnam and understood respect, honor, and the proper way to handle troublemakers. George, we got some young folks who need a lesson in respecting their elders. Think you and the boys might be interested in a little education project. As Harold made his way home that afternoon, his walker carrying the precious folder of information, he felt more alive than he had in years. The road demons thought they were dealing with a feeble old man, but they had unknowingly picked a fight with someone who had spent his military career gathering intelligence and planning operations. In intelligence work, Harold remembered his old commander saying, "The key is to have all your pieces in place before making your move." Well, Harold was placing his pieces carefully. The road demons might have motorcycles and leather jackets, but Harold had something far more powerful, a lifetime of connections, the respect of his community, and a strategic mind that age hadn't dulled one bit. As he reached his front porch, Harold smiled. Tomorrow would be another day at Betty's diner, but soon things would be very different. The road demons were about to learn that they had started a fight with the wrong veteran. On Saturday morning, the Veterans Community Center buzzed with unusual activity. Harold sat at the head of a long table, his folder of research spread out before him. Around the table sat an impressive group. Jim Martinez from City Hall, Robert Chen the lawyer, Captain Thomas from the police department, and most importantly, George Washington Adia with 5 other members of the Veterans Riders Association. Gentlemen, Harold began, his voice clear and strong. Thank you for coming. We have a situation that needs addressing. He carefully laid out the evidence he'd gathered about the road demons, explaining their pattern of intimidation and the impact on Betty's diner. George Washington Ayoa, a tall man with gray hair and a leather vest covered in military patches, leaned forward. Harold, I've been hearing about these road demons. They're giving all bikers a bad name. My veterans riding group has been watching them for months. Captain Thomas picked up one of Harold's detailed reports. This is impressive work, Harold. The kind of documentation we need to take action. We have to be careful. We don't want to escalate the situation into something dangerous. That's why I called all of you, Harold replied, pulling out a handwritten plan. We're not going to fight them. We're going to outsmart them. Robert Chen, the lawyer, nodded appreciatively as he reviewed Harold's notes. The noise ordinance violations alone give us grounds for action. Add in the unauthorized gathering permits and potential criminal activities. We have a solid legal case. Jim Martinez from City Hall added, I can fast-track some of these permit reviews. Maybe schedule a few surprise inspections. As they discussed strategy, more veterans began arriving at the community center. Word had spread through the veteran network, and men and women who had served in various conflicts, from World War II to recent wars, came to offer their support. Harold watched as George briefed his Veterans Riders members. These weren't young troublemakers playing at being tough. These were disciplined men and women who understood honor and service. Their leather vests displayed combat medals and unit insignias earned through real sacrifice. Starting Monday, George announced, we'll have members of our group having breakfast at Betty's. Regular customers who just happen to be veterans who ride motorcycles. Nothing illegal, nothing confrontational. Just veterans supporting a local business. Captain Thomas outlined the police department's role. We'll increase patrols in the area. By the book, professional but very visible. If these road demons are planning anything illegal, they'll find it hard to operate with us around. The meeting continued for hours as they refined their plan. Harold sat quietly, watching his allies work together. This was different from his war days, but the principles were the same. Gather intelligence, build alliances, plan carefully, and execute with precision. Betty arrived later in the morning, bringing coffee and pastries for everyone. Her eyes widened at the sight of so many veterans gathered to help save her diner. Harold, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I don't know how to thank you for all this. Harold patted her hand gently. You've been serving us breakfast for years, Betty. Now it's our turn to serve you. By afternoon, the plan was set. The Veterans Riders would provide a visible presence of legitimate bikers. The police would increase patrols. City Hall would enforce regulations. Local veterans would return to the diner, showing the road demons that the community stood united. As the meeting wound down, a young veteran who had served in Afghanistan approached Harold. Sir, he said respectfully, I just wanted to say, this is exactly why we serve. Not just to fight wars, but to protect our communities. Harold nodded, understanding perfectly. This was about more than just saving a diner. It was about standing up for what was right, protecting their community. As everyone prepared to leave, George Washington Ayers stayed behind to help Harold gather his papers. You know, Harold, George said thoughtfully, these young troublemakers think being tough is about making others afraid. They don't understand that real strength is about standing together and protecting others. Harold carefully put his papers back in their folder. In the war, he replied, we learned that the strongest unit wasn't the one with the most weapons, but the one where everyone looked out for each other. Walking home that evening, Harold felt confident. The road demons might have youth and intimidation on their side, but he had something far more powerful. A community of veterans and citizens united in purpose. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, Harold knew they had the strongest army of all, people who understood the true meaning of service and respect. And showing that true strength comes from unity and respect, not intimidation. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. Harold arrived at Betty's diner at his usual time, but today was different. As he approached with his walker, he noticed 3 motorcycles already parked in the lot. Their riders wearing the Veterans Riders Association patches. They nodded respectfully as he passed. Inside, the diner had a different atmosphere. Captain Thomas sat at the counter in uniform, enjoying his coffee. 2 more veterans occupied a booth near the door. Betty moved between tables with a smile that hadn't been seen in weeks. At 8:30 a.m., the familiar rumble of the road demons' motorcycles filled the air. Snake and his gang pulled into the parking lot, but suddenly stopped short. Through the window, Harold watched their confusion as they noticed the other motorcycles. Big, well-maintained machines with military service stickers and veteran plates. Snake led his group into the diner, trying to maintain their usual swagger, but Harold could see the uncertainty in their movements. The gang found their regular corner already occupied by 3 Vietnam veterans, who showed no intention of moving. What's going on here? Snake demanded, looking around the now crowded diner. Before anyone could respond, the rumble of more motorcycles filled the air. George Washington II led a group of 10 veterans riders into the parking lot, their bikes forming a perfect line. They entered the diner in an orderly fashion, their combat boots and leather vests creating an impressive sight. Morning, Betty, George called out cheerfully. Table for 10, please. We heard this place serves the best breakfast in town. Snake and his gang found themselves surrounded by veterans of all ages, men and women who had served in conflicts from World War II to Afghanistan. The road demons' usual intimidation tactics seemed small compared to the quiet confidence of real warriors. Just then, Jim Martinez from City Hall entered, followed by two building inspectors. "Good morning, everyone," he announced. "Just conducting a routine inspection. Oh, and by the way, there's a new city ordinance about motorcycle parking. Captain Thomas here has all the details." Captain Thomas stood up, adjusting his uniform. "That's right. We're enforcing strict noise and gathering regulations in this area. Citations will be issued for any violations." Snake's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. He turned to Harold, who sat calmly at his usual booth. "You get this, old man?" Harold looked up from his coffee. "No, son, you get this. When you decided to bully people who've spent their lives protecting others from bullies." George Washington IA stepped forward, his combat medals gleaming on his vest. "You see, boys, there's a difference between acting tough and being strong. Real strength, it's about protecting others, not terrorizing them." The road demons found themselves in an impossible situation. They were outnumbered by legitimate bikers who had faced real battles. They were being watched by law enforcement and city officials. Their usual tactics of intimidation seemed childish in the face of such organized opposition. "This isn't over," Snake muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, Robert Chin spoke up from his booth. Legal documents spread before him. "It is over. I have here several sworn complaints about harassment, noise violations, and suspicious activities. We can handle this officially, or you can find somewhere else to spend your mornings." The road demons looked to their leader, waiting for his response. Snake glanced around the diner, taking in the veterans' quiet strength, the police presence, and the official documents. For the first time, he looked young and uncertain. "Let's go," he finally said to his gang. "This place is dead anyway." As they turned to leave, Harold's voice rang out clearly. "Son, remember this feeling. Remember what happened when you tried to push around a community that stands together. Maybe next time, you'll choose a better path." The road demons filed out of the diner, their boots no longer thumping quite so loudly on the floor. The sound of their motorcycles faded into the distance, but this time, they didn't rev their engines in defiance. Betty hurried over to Harold's booth with a fresh pot of coffee. "Harold Mitchell," she said, her eyes shining, "you're something else." Around the diner, veterans and regular customers began to mingle. The veterans' riders shared stories with older veterans, while Captain Thomas and Jim Martinez discussed plans to keep the neighborhood safe. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, and exactly what Betty's diner had always been meant to be. Harold sat back in his booth, a slight smile on his face. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from bringing people together to stand up for what's right. 2 months had passed since the confrontation at Betty's diner. The early morning sun streamed through the windows as Harold made his way to his usual booth, his walker moving steadily across the newly renovated floor. The diner had undergone quite a transformation, but the warm, welcoming atmosphere remained the same. Betty's diner had become something unexpected, a gathering place where different generations of veterans shared their stories over coffee and pancakes. The parking lot, once dominated by the road demons, now regularly hosted a mix of vehicles, cars, motorcycles belonging to the veterans' riders, and even a few bicycles. This particular morning was special. Harold adjusted his veteran's cap as he watched Betty hanging up a new sign above the counter. "Veterans welcome. Heroes eat free every Wednesday." The diner had never been busier. The publicity from the road demons incident had turned the small restaurant into a local landmark. "Morning, Harold," called George Washington II, who sat at the counter in his leather vest. He had made it a point to stop by at least twice a week, often bringing different members of his riding group. Today, 3 younger veterans sat with him, listening intently as he shared stories from his service days. The bell above the door chimed, and Harold looked up to see a familiar face, but not one he expected. It was Snake, the former leader of the road demons, standing alone and looking very different. Gone was the aggressive swagger and intimidating leather jacket. Instead, he wore plain clothes and carried himself with an uncertainty that seemed out of character. The diner fell quiet as Snake made his way to Harold's booth. Betty watched nervously from behind the counter, but Harold gave her a reassuring nod. "Mr. Mitchell," Snake said, his voice softer than Harold remembered, "may I sit down?" Harold gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Of course, son." Snake settled into the booth, looking down at his hands. "I've been wanting to come by for a while now," he began. "I owe you an apology. Not just you, everyone here." Harold listened quietly as Snake continued. "After what happened, I did some thinking. A lot of thinking, actually. My grandfather was a veteran, but I never really understood what that meant until I saw how you handled everything. You could have just called the cops, but instead, you showed real leadership." From his jacket pocket, Snake pulled out a wrinkled envelope. "I joined the army," he said, pushing the envelope across the table. "Ship out for basic training next week. Thought you should know." Harold picked up the envelope, reading the military recruitment papers inside. A smile crossed his weathered face. "Sometimes," he said, "it takes facing the right kind of strength to find your own path." Betty appeared at their table with 2 cups of coffee. "On the house," she said, surprising both men with her warm smile. Around them, the diner buzzed with its usual morning activity. Veterans from different eras shared tables with local residents. The veterans' riders had become regular fixtures, their presence now bringing comfort rather than intimidation. Captain Thomas stopped by occasionally, not to maintain order, but to enjoy the community that had formed. "You know," Harold said, stirring his coffee, "strength isn't about making others afraid. It's about standing up for what's right and protecting those who need it. Sounds like you're starting to understand that." Snake nodded, his eyes moving around the diner. "The other guys, the road demons, they've mostly moved on. Some of them are asking about military service too. Funny how things work out." As they talked, more regulars filtered in. Mrs. Peterson returned to her crossword puzzle spot by the window. Mr. Thompson resumed his daily ritual of reading the newspaper at the counter. The diner had returned to its peaceful routine, but it was stronger now, protected by an unlikely alliance of veterans and community members. Before leaving, Snake stood and extended his hand to Harold. "Thank you, sir, for showing me there's a better way to be strong." Harold shook the young man's hand firmly. "Make us proud, son, and remember, Betty's Diner will be here when you come home on leave." As Snake left, Harold looked around at what his stand against bullying had created. The diner wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It had become a symbol of community strength and unity. Veterans of all ages had found a home here, sharing their experiences and wisdom with younger generations. Betty brought Harold his usual French toast, now named the Veteran's Special on the menu. "You know, Harold," she said with a smile, "some battles are won with bullets, but you won this one with something much stronger. You won it with character." Harold smiled, adjusting his veteran's cap. At 93, he had learned that the greatest victories often came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into friends. The road demons had wanted to take over Betty's Diner, but instead, they had helped create something far more powerful, a community united by respect, service, and understanding.